Hello, my friends. Welcome to Echoes of Forgotten Lives. I am glad you are here today. Take a slow breath, relax your shoulders, and let this story begin. Now imagine standing on an icy runway, snow falling steadily, a plane full of young football players waiting to take off, laughing, joking, still buzzing from a match played the night before, their bags still packed with souvenirs from a foreign city they had only briefly seen. Perhaps you have watched a football match yourself, cheering for a team that felt, for 90 minutes, like something worth caring about deeply, something bigger than the simple game unfolding in front of you. This is the story of Manchester United, the club that rebuilt itself from tragedy. But what happened on that runway would change the club and the sport itself forever. Our story begins in the city of Manchester, in the country of England, in the year 1878, when a group of railway workers formed a small football club, originally called Newton Heath, named simply after the local railway depot, a large working yard where trains were maintained and stored, where many of them worked. The club struggled for years, playing in scrappy local leagues, changing its name to Manchester United in 1902, after a period of serious financial trouble nearly forced it to close entirely. It slowly built a modest local following, long before anyone could have predicted the extraordinary, and at times heartbreaking, story it would one day become part of. By the middle of the 20th century, a manager named Matt Busby had taken charge of the club, and he built something genuinely unusual for the era. Rather than relying only on established, experienced players, Busby invested heavily in young talent, developing teenagers through the club's own academy, and trusting them with first-team football far earlier than most managers of his time dared to. This talented young squad became affectionately known as the Busby Babes, admired across England for their skill and their obvious, thrilling promise. Players like Duncan Edwards, still only in his early 20s, were already being spoken about as some of the finest talents English football had ever produced. Players whose best years, everyone assumed, were still comfortably ahead of them. To ordinary fans crowding into Old Trafford each Saturday afternoon, cheering from the terraces, the same way people still gather around televisions today, this young team represented something rare, genuine hope, arriving all at once in a country still recovering from the difficult years of war. On the 6th of February 1958, the team was traveling home from Belgrade, in what is now Serbia, after securing a place in the semi-final of the European Cup, an early forerunner of today's Champions League, having drawn the match 2-2 the night before, enough to advance on aggregate. Their chartered plane, a British European Airways aircraft, stopped in Munich, in West Germany, to refuel, a routine stop made without any particular concern, on a journey that had already carried the exhausted squad across much of the continent. But heavy snow and slush covered the runway that afternoon. After 2 aborted takeoff attempts, the pilots tried a third time. The plane failed to gain sufficient speed, skidded off the end of the runway, crashed through a perimeter fence, and struck a nearby house and a fuel truck before breaking apart. 23 people died that afternoon, including 8 of the club's own players, several journalists traveling with the team, and members of the club's own staff. Manager Matt Busby survived, though so critically injured that doctors reportedly gave him last rites, a religious blessing given to those believed close to death, not once, but twice, in the days that followed. As his condition repeatedly worsened inside a German hospital ward, his own family called urgently to his bedside, uncertain whether they would arrive in time. Among those who did not survive was Duncan Edwards, who clung to life in a Munich hospital for 15 days after the crash, before finally succumbing to his injuries at just 21 years old. His death, arriving so long after the crash itself, allowed the entire country a slow, agonizing final week of hope, before that hope was finally, painfully extinguished. Newspapers across England ran his photograph on their front pages, and thousands of ordinary people, many with no direct connection to the club at all, wrote letters of condolence to a team and a family they had never personally met. There is something you may have heard about this tragedy, my friends, repeated so often that it has quietly hardened into a kind of shorthand, that the entire Busby Babes squad perished on that runway, an entire golden generation wiped out in a single afternoon. But here is the more complete truth. Of the 16 players traveling that day, 8 died and 8 survived, including a young Bobby Charlton, defender Bill Folks, and goalkeeper Harry Gregg, who ran back into the burning wreckage more than once, pulling injured teammates and a mother and her child to safety before the flames could reach them, actions that would later earn him genuine recognition as a hero, far beyond the football world itself. The tragedy was genuinely devastating, claiming extraordinary young talent. The club, and English football more broadly, would spend years quietly mourning. But it did not erase the club, or its remaining players entirely, a distinction easy to lose once a story has been repeated and simplified for long enough. Remarkably, the club played its next scheduled match just 13 days after the crash, an FA Cup fixture against Sheffield Wednesday, fielding a patched-together team of reserves and hastily arranged emergency signings, assembled largely by assistant manager Jimmy Murphy, who had missed the fatal trip only because he was coaching Wales in a separate World Cup qualifying match that same week. Old Trafford, the club's own stadium, was filled that night with a grieving, disbelieving crowd, watching a team that barely resembled the one that had flown out to Belgrade only 2 weeks earlier. United won 5-0, a result that felt, to many in the stands, less like sport and more like a community, simply refusing to fall apart in public. Murphy held the grieving club together through those first unbearable weeks, while Busby himself remained hospitalized, uncertain whether he would ever return to football at all. Busby did eventually recover and returned to management later that same year, though those close to him said he was never quite the same man afterward, carrying the weight of the crash quietly for the remainder of his own life. Rebuilding the club took far longer than any single dramatic comeback story might suggest. Busby signed new players carefully, blended them with the survivors, including a young Bobby Charlton, still recovering from his own injuries, and a promising Northern Irish teenager named George Best, who would soon become one of the most gifted attacking players English football had ever produced. Denis Law, a sharp, prolific Scottish striker, joined the reconstruction as well. Busby spent the following decade, quietly, patiently, constructing something new out of what remained, resisting the temptation to rush, even as impatient supporters and hopeful newspapers occasionally wondered aloud whether the old glory would ever genuinely return. 10 years after the crash, almost to the day, Manchester United reached the final of the European Cup once again, this time at Wembley Stadium in London, facing the Portuguese club Benfica, themselves led by the brilliant forward Eusebio. The match remained tense and closely fought until extra time, when United suddenly found a burst of energy, scoring 3 additional goals in a remarkable final 20 minutes. Bobby Charlton, one of the crash's own survivors, wore the captain's armband that night and scored twice himself, in a performance that felt, to those watching, quietly symbolic of everything the club had endured to reach this exact moment. United won 4-1, becoming the first English club ever to lift the trophy. Witnesses that evening described Busby standing quietly on the pitch afterward, tears on his face, saying almost nothing at all, simply watching his rebuilt team celebrate a victory a decade in the making. Some victories are not simply won. They are carried, slowly, across a decade, by people who refuse to put the weight down. And here is what stays with me most, my friends, thinking about this story today. Manchester United's rebuilding was never one dramatic, sudden triumph, wrapped neatly into a single unforgettable night. It was 10 patient years of careful, unglamorous work, carried out by people who had every reason to give up, and chose, instead, to keep building anyway, season after difficult season, without any guarantee that the effort would ever be rewarded. Learning a new language often feels the same way. Progress rarely arrives as one clean, decisive victory. It arrives slowly, through ordinary days of quiet practice, long after the initial excitement or the initial heartbreak has faded into something steadier, something closer to simple, patient habit. So keep going, my friends. Keep listening. Keep learning, one patient season at a time. Whatever you are quietly rebuilding in your own life does not need to happen all at once to still be genuinely worth the effort. If this story stayed with you today, you are certainly not alone. Manchester United's rebuilding remains one of the most quietly remarkable stories in the entire history of sport, precisely because it took real time, real patience, and real courage to complete, with no shortcuts and no guarantees along the way. There are so many more forgotten lives and forgotten stories waiting patiently for us to uncover them together, one at a time. Each one carries a quiet lesson, wrapped gently inside an unforgettable moment. I would truly love for you to be here when we open the next one together. Subscribing costs you nothing at all, but it means we get to keep exploring these lost corners of history, side by side, story after story. Somewhere out there, right now, is another name history has almost completely forgotten. And soon, my friends, we will bring it gently back into the light, together. Tell me, in the comments below, have you ever had to rebuild something slowly, after a genuine setback, rather than fixing it all at once, learning to measure progress in seasons instead of single moments? Until next time, take care of yourselves, and never stop learning, one patient step at a time.